What we've been doing in here for the past few weeks with a long break over Lent and Easter is to go back through the fundamentals of my book, The Fifth Way, which is kind of the foundational document for a lot of the ways that we approach our spirituality here at The Effect. And so to look at Jesus from a first century Aramaic point of view is key because it changes everything in terms of the way that we interpret the words that are preserved for us in the Gospels. And also to be able to realize that this isn't a relationship that is passive or remote. We can't just read things secondhand. They need to be experienced firsthand. And when you see Jesus in his own setting as a first century Jew, you realize he is a mystic and a contemplative. And that is absolutely essential for us to understand, because what he's telling us is that we can do the things that he did, which means we can experience God firsthand, and not through clergy, not through religion, not through even a text. We can experience God. Those are the two pillars on which we stand. And what we've been doing is going through the first principles of the Fifth Way to try to understand more and more of what that means, how deep the rabbit hole actually goes. And so this morning we're going to continue. And I sort of made the case already, but why is the Hebrew Jesus so important for us to understand? I was raised Catholic. I never heard about a Hebrew Jesus. In my 30s, I moved over to the evangelical church. I never heard about a Hebrew Jesus. But when I started studying on my own the origins of Christianity, where I figured I would be able to find that which was most relevant and true, the Hebrew Jesus just jumped out. You could not understand Jesus' message without moving into the history, the culture, the context, the languages that he spoke and to whom he spoke, because that was critical as well. Why is it so important for us to understand that Jesus was a Hebrew and that we need to see him through that lens? Because we have been called as Christians and Jews as well, people of the book. We're people of the book. We revere our scriptures, our Judeo-Christian Bible. And that is the main source of our revelation and the main source of how we build the whole structure of our religion and our faith. But what that means is that God's word, the revelation from God, is going to be interpreted from that text. And make no mistake, every understanding from any text, whether it's an email, a letter, or a sacred book, is an interpretation. What we read is not necessarily what the author intended. We need to interpret that. And so we're trying to figure out, what was Jesus' original intent? That's what we want to know. I want to be the most literal guy in the room, but I want that literal understanding to be of Jesus' original intent, and not anything that I have understood papered over from 2,000 years away in a culture that is completely alien and a language that couldn't be further from ancient Semitic languages. Now, we can't get back into Jesus' mind. We can't see what it was he originally intended. But what we can do, to the best of our ability, is to reconstruct what his first hearers would have understood by his words in their language at that time. That's what we're trying to do. And to realize that you cannot just translate words. It's impossible to translate word for word from one language to another. Did you know that? You can't do it. What we're doing is we're trying to translate from one agreement to another agreement. And what I mean by agreement is any language comes out of the agreed upon experience that a group of people are having who produce the language in the first place. It's their view of the world, their worldview. It's their understanding of their culture, their understanding of religion, science, spirituality. All of that is understood between people of the same group. So when they speak, it's coming out of that understanding. We come from a completely different agreement here in the West 2,000 years later. So the translation has to go from agreement to agreement. In other words, we need to take a look at their language. And most importantly, we need to take a look at not only what the words mean, but we need to take a look at the idiomatic phrases as well. And you know what an idiom is? It's a phrase that you cannot get the meaning from just by understanding the definitions of the words in the phrase. It's raining cats and dogs. Imagine someone 2,000 years ago coming to that phrase, oh, back in the 2020s, it used to rain quadrupeds from the sky. That's what we mean by idiomatic phrases. We need to know their culture. We need to know their history. We need to understand their science. And there is absolutely no such thing as a word-for-word translation. Even in Spanish, hace calor literally means it makes hot. We would never say it that way. We just say it's hot, or whew, but it makes hot. We have to make a certain understanding and an interpretation of that so that it makes sense in the target language. I want to, the other one that's really amazing in Aramaic is the first line of the Beatitudes where Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. And we've talked about this. What does poor in spirit mean to you? Well, pretty much universally in our culture, in our agreement, it means something negative. It means you're lacking in spiritual gifts. It means you don't have something that you really need. But it's an idiomatic phrase in ancient Aramaic. And so, Lameskina Baruch literally means someone who is got an attitude of poverty even if they're rich. Someone who is not domineering. Someone who is not overbearing. Who is always present and considerate of everyone around them. That's poverty of spirit. So if we don't understand the idioms and where they come from, we're going to get a completely different understanding. And why would Jesus say you're blessed if you're poor in spirit? Why would he say that you have the kingdom if you're poor in spirit? And we think that's a deficiency. I wanted to read from you from Genesis 6:16. And if you have your handouts, it might be a good time to pull them out just so you can see what's not going to end up on the screen. But in Genesis 6:16, this is God telling Noah how to make the ark. All right? And so in our good NASB version, which is a word-for-word translation, by the way, as close as you can get, New American Standard, translated the line this way: you shall make a window for the ark and finish it to a cubit from the top. Now, we might not know what a cubit is. It's the distance between the elbow and the end of your fingers, but at least we got some sort of measurement there. And finish it to a cubit from the top, and set the door of the ark in the side of it. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. Perfectly understandable, except that we wouldn't necessarily know what a cubit is. But if you take that line and translate it exactly word for word from the original Hebrew, it comes out like this. A light you do to an ark, and to a cubit you complete it. From to over it, and a door of the ark in its side, you put unders 20 and 30 you do. What in the world do you do with that? We read that in English, and we have no idea what they're talking about. It took a scholar who understood enough about the culture, enough about cross-referencing different scriptures to try to find out what the meanings of particular words might have been, to be able to give us the translation that we've got. And then add to that, in Hebrew scrolls, there are only consonants that appear, no vowels. And they are just a string of letters. There's no parsing whatsoever. There's no space between words. There's no punctuation marks. Not only that, the scrolls are full justified on both sides. So you have a strict number of characters that go from from left to right to left, because it's backwards from us. And it's that way straight down. So if the letters break within a word, the word starts on the next line. It's just a mass of consonant letters. And then add to it, so you got to know how to parse the words. You got to know what the words mean. You got to know what the idiomatic expressions. All of this stuff goes into trying to understand. The translator, in other words, is making constant choices based on his or her worldview and their understanding of the language and their understanding of the target audience that they are going to be speaking to. They need to add in the vowels and the words and the punctuation and the parsing and the meaning as best they possibly can. So now we spent the last 4 weeks on one word, trying to understand one word that Jesus uses over and over, which is kingdom, which is probably the most important word that you can understand from Jesus, because he hangs his entire message on that structure. So if we don't understand what kingdom is, we're never going to understand the rest of his agreement. But here we are, 4 weeks trying to understand this one word. But there are other big words as well, upon which our theology hangs. What about words like law? What about words like faith or sin or forgiveness or good or evil? Those words all mean something very different when we put them back into first century Aramaic and back into the context. And so the understanding of those words is going to change dramatically, not only the understanding of a line, a verse, a passage, but also the theology that undergirds that. The understanding of our relationship with God all changes. And so what we need to be able to do is to clear out the misunderstandings. That's absolutely critical. I wanted to read just a couple paragraphs from the book, The Fifth Way, and see if this kind of puts it a little bit more into perspective. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. This is as true today as when Franklin Roosevelt recognized it in his first inaugural address 3 years into the Great Depression, calling it nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Because this is true, because fear itself is the imagined separation between us and all things kingdom, we must enter deeper into the Aramaic agreement to begin to realize that our fears are really only misunderstandings. Yeshua's entire mission and message was to show us the Father, the good news of a love so utter that it can't ever be lost because it can't be gained. It simply exists. Our fears keep us from embracing such a love, which is why Yeshua works so hard to clear up any misunderstanding. He had to use words big enough to describe the bigness of this love and the nature of our relationship with it. Words not big in size, but in scope. With only 1 or 2 syllables for the most part, these words carry immense power for their size. Big words like freedom and forgiveness, good and evil, sin and salvation survive in our theologies. Our theologies turn on them as on hinges or hubs. But like all the other words coming out of Yeshua's agreement, if we don't know what was meant by them, our misunderstandings foster that persistent sense of separation, fear itself. The concept of kingdom as the synchronization of the desires of a king and his people, of God and mankind, was an ancient Hebrew concept that reflected God's intended relationship with us from the very beginning. Unity and oneness. That the people had bastardized the original concepts of both kingdom and law into dictatorial rule and legalistic obedience was exactly why Yeshua worked so hard on misunderstandings. There was a previous understanding that was lost over time and needed to be recovered and fulfilled if people were to be restored to their God and to each other. Yeshua said that if we followed him along his fifth way, the truth would make us free. He said he came to bring abundant life. He said not to worry, that his burden was light, and that he loved as the Father loved, and neither would ever leave us. Fear itself is the opposite of all this, creating in us a slavish, an obsessive adherence to the big words in our theologies and the codes of our rules. And a rule is really just another layer of separation between us and all that Yeshua envisions for us. As far as we may have come towards seeing kingdom as Yeshua saw it, misunderstandings remain. And each misunderstanding is another dent in our ability to see the totality of God's love for us, a hole in our ability to trust enough in that love to begin laying down our fears. Continuing to explore the ground around kingdom, 6 pairs of big words viewed from inside the Aramaic agreement may help us clear up lingering misunderstandings, pull the layered masks off fear itself, and begin to trust kingdom as both the destination and the way of our Father's perfect love. So let's be clear about all of this. Nothing is going to change in our lives from these new ideas, these 6 pairs of words that we're going to be going through over the next few weeks, until they become action in our lives, until they become experienced in our lives, until they become muscle memory in our lives. That's when our lives will change. Just the knowledge of them, it's a start, it's a first step, but it's not going to take us very far until we actually act on it, risk something in the acting of it. But the thoughts are important too, because the thoughts can also change our actions. They can reset the stage. They can reset the paradigm for us. Just as Jesus said right out of the box in Mark 1:15, he said, repent and believe, which in Aramaic means trust the gospel, trust the good news, trust this love, this connection that I'm showing you right now. And if we're going to repent, which simply means to change direction, you're going this way, you're going to think better of it and go another way. So if we're going to do that, which direction do we go? Now, the gospel itself, the good news, that we are loved with a love that can't be lost because it can't even be gained. It just self-exists. That's a direction, perfect love. And that can start to clear off some misunderstandings for us. But we need more. What is happening here in these 6 pairs of words that are going to be law and effect, good and evil, sin and shalom, freedom and forgiveness, and bread and blood? The one we're going to look at today, the pair, is mercy and justice. That is going to be key and critical for us to understand here. Like Kingdom, if we don't know how mercy and justice work and where they work, then Jesus isn't going to make any sense to us. We're not going to know what he's talking about. And the fear will remain as well. Now, at first glance, mercy and justice seem contradictory. They seem completely opposed. But both of them are expressions of God's love. But they're tuned to 2 different contexts. How does that work? Let's take a look at another couple paragraphs. The Hebrew scriptures call these 2 principles mercy and justice. We'd probably be closer to the concept by calling them compassion and justice. But in the end, they both boil down to love and fairness. The Hebrew word hesed, usually translated loving kindness, probably gets us closest to the tender fondness, affection, graciousness, protectiveness, and willingness to show favor that mercy and compassion imply. Justice, on the other hand, is a reasoned balancing of the scales, a calculated fairness, righting of wrongs, making things equal again when they have become unequal. The 2 principles move even farther apart when you consider that compassion is not just, all right? And justice is not compassionate. You can put that one on your fridge, right? Compassion is not just, and justice is not compassionate. And they should not be. If you think of justice as getting what you deserve, either positively or negatively, then mercy is not getting what you negatively deserve. And compassion could be considered giving what is not positively deserved, or at least earned. Mercy and compassion do not right any wrongs. They deliberately unbalance the scales of justice. They are unashamedly unfair in order to favor the object of affection. Justice, in order to be completely fair, must willingly ignore and suppress any feelings of affection or desire for mercy that may arise, like a judge who must follow the letter of the law, even if it keeps her tossing and turning all night. But though mercy and justice seem diametrically opposed and separate in this way, at root, they are both manifestations of the same reign of unity, which is the best definition of kingdom that we can come up with in English. Both manifestations of the same reign of unity, of God's love, and both are critical aspects of ethical decision-making. Knowing the difference between the 2 and when and where each must take precedence for the greatest good, or shalom, are critical to making choices that create and preserve kingdom. Now, God is supposed to be both merciful and just, right? How? How in the world can God do that when we've just talked about the differences between the 2? If God's love is perfect, though, then God's love is not just. If God's love is compassionate and merciful, it is not just. That means that God's love deliberately unbalances the scales of justice in favor of the beloved. Now, truthfully, we don't want fairness in love, do we? We want favor, don't we? Don't we all want to be teacher's pet? Of course we do. We want favor. But it's confusing because Scripture seems to flip back and forth between the 2 kind of willy-nilly. And not only that, but Jesus is all over the map when it comes to these. One more. Taking a look at some scriptures. And these will come up later, and we'll talk about them. But just for right now, Jesus says, you will always have the poor with you. Remember that one? Matthew 26. How is it compassionate for Yeshua to offhandedly tell us that poverty will always be with us in response to his followers' lecture on the needs of the poor? This could have been sold and given to the poor. Why was it wasted here? You're always going to have the poor with you. Really? How is that compassionate? Give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, Matthew 22. This is where Jesus has been asked, should we pay taxes to the Romans? These unjust, horrible taxes that are just beating our people down and destroying our nation. And what does Jesus say? He says, give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, but give to God that which is God's. How is that merciful? That we should continue to pay unjust taxes to a cruel and oppressive government? And yet this is Jesus' stand. Sell all you have and give it to the poor, Mark 10. How is it fair to tell someone to sell all he had earned just to give to the poor, who we're always going to have with us anyway? What's the point of that? If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also, which in that culture meant you're pretty much standing there naked, because they only had 2 articles of clothing, and they would have understood this. If you're being sued, where is the justice in being told to surrender more than is required, willingly and without complaint, to the point you have nothing left and are standing naked in public? At Matthew 5, he says, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Don't resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other as well. What kind of moral code demands judicial condemnation for simply being angry with a brother, yet turns around and says not to resist an evil person? When struck once, simply wait to be struck again? Taken at face value, the simple meaning of all of these passages seem to make no moral sense, defy the precepts of both justice and mercy. Again, as Jesus would say, we need new ears to hear. If we are trying to repent, if we're trying to move in a different direction toward kingdom, where are we going with all of this? Where's the compass we can use? Now, there is a reason that this is also unclear, because we're missing the context for mercy and justice. And that context is going to be macro and micro. 2 words we need to understand. The macro, of course, is going to be the largest group of things. And the micro is going to be the smallest number, or down to the individual. And so we understand those 2 concepts. You know, if you raise kids or babysit kids, when you've got 2 children, it's one dynamic. But when you add the third, everything changes. Have you noticed that? Okay, I see some heads going up and down. Everything changes with that third child. Why? Because now you have a group. You have moved from the micro to the macro. Now it's all about fairness. Everything has to be absolutely fair. 2 people can kind of flow back and forth a little bit in relationship. Yeah, even kids can do that. But you add that third child and everything changes. This is what we're talking about here. We live on 2 levels, in 2 contexts simultaneously. We are both a part of the micro and the macro. Anytime we're talking to a person, that's a micro conversation. But it's always in the context of a larger group. Right now, I'm having a conversation to a group, and you're having a group experience. But there's those 2 always, and they're fighting with each other pretty much all the time. But we need to be aware that we have those 2 contexts. Out of high school, I actually joined a monastery in the Catholic Church. And one of the first morning that I was there, we had Mass every morning, and the priest would come, and we would be filtered out there. I was beat from the plane ride from LA to Chicago, and I was living a completely different kind of lifestyle out here. This is back in the 70s. And so I was kind of a young hippie back then. And I showed up to Mass that first day late, bleary-eyed, staggering into the chapel, wearing my jeans that were all ripped up and repaired with macrame and embroidery and patches. I think there was a U.S. flag was there, and this over here and whatnot. And I was wearing that baseball undershirt, with the blue sleeves and the white body, and I was barefoot. And I walked in, and I didn't think anything about it. I just walked in, and of course I was immediately escorted back out again and told what was the proper decorum. But it wasn't only just for Mass. All throughout, any time you were inside the building at all, you had to wear shoes and socks. I never wore shoes and socks anywhere ever, And that was a real point of contention. And of course, me being the rebel that I was back then, I'd try to sneak around, not having my shoes and socks on. I'd always get caught. So then I started putting shoes on with no socks. And so they would get to the point where they would come and look under the table and lift my pant leg. And then one time I actually went out to put my socks on, but I put them on over my shoes. Because, of course, he didn't tell me what order I had to wear the socks. What was going on here? They were trying to take an individual and put that individual into the context of the group. How do you learn to live in community? And when we were living with multi-generations, us postulants, us first years, we were 17 and 18 years old, but we had also retired monks who were there, who were in their 70s and 80s and everything in between. How do you homogenize a group like that? How do you learn to live in the context, the macro context, and at the same time realizing that you're an individual? Well, you had to give up a lot of your individuality in order to do it, but it can be done. I just was an idiot and was fighting it the whole time. I finally got on board, but it took me a while. But this is the issue. We live in these two contexts both at the same time. But here's what we need to understand. In the macro, in the group, in the largest number of things, what does love look like? Love looks like justice in the macro. The highest good in the macro, in the group, is justice. Why? Because without fairness, without absolute equality, without just balancing the scales, you will lose the integrity of the group completely. Just like those 3 kids that you're trying to babysit. As soon as they understand that you're not being fair, you lose their respect, you lose their cooperation completely. It's that way with nations, it's that way with societies, it's that way with churches and families, it's all the same. Justice is going to be the highest good in the macro. But in the micro, love looks like mercy and compassion. Has to. Because if you don't exercise that first, you're going to lose the relationship completely. What we need to be able to do is to learn how to code switch, which is a term that sociologists use. It's a lot of times used for children whose parents are divorced, let's say, and they have to go from home to home, and there's different rules in each home, and so they have to code switch between the two, back and forth. But it's going to be the same thing for us if you look at us even politically, liberals and conservatives, What is the fight that we're having so assiduously between liberals and conservatives? Well, liberals are more about compassion and mercy. That's the whole stated reason for why they do what they do. And they want to legislate that compassion. They want the government, the society to reflect those compassionate values that they have, which is a beautiful thing. But remember, compassion unbalances the scales of justice. And once you do that, you lose the integrity of the group. And so we need to understand that when we are code shifting between the two, that justice has to be maintained in the group. That doesn't mean you don't have any compassion, but the compassion can't be codified in the law. It's got to be put into the hands of those who are at key places in the system, like judges. They need to have judicial discretion to be able to add back in the compassion to a specific individual in a specific case, while justice is still being maintained. But on the other side, the conservative, who is more concerned with order and law and justice, if they start to impose zero tolerance policies, then that leads to absolute absurdity. Like a child being expelled from school because they brought a little plastic knife to put peanut butter on their bread. Or it destroys relationships in the micro if we focus on justice. We're all going to be 50-50 here. Well, if that's your take in a personal relationship, you won't have that relationship for very long. And so we need to learn how to code shift between those two and realize love looks like justice in the macro, love looks like mercy and compassion in the micro. And we need to do our best to maintain those even as we're dealing with each situation as it comes up. Have you ever wondered why the Old Testament and the New Testament seem so different? The Old Testament God seems like this vengeful, wrathful, intolerant God who orders genocide sometimes. What in the world is going on with that as in contrast to Jesus, who is all about mercy and compassion and love and connection and acceptance? See, all of Jesus' teachings are micro, whereas the Old Testament is the story of the nation of Israel's relationship with God. It is a macro text. The New Testament is a micro text. And so justice, maintaining that law and order, is the highest good in the Old Testament. It doesn't mean that the mercy and compassion isn't there, because it absolutely is. But it changes the nature of the way that the text is written as opposed to the New Testament. In the New Testament, Jesus is always talking to individuals, heart-to-heart connection. He's trying to get them to take the next step. And he's always saying that kingdom is not the institution. Kingdom begins within. Kingdom is intensely micro, starting within and then moving outward. So now let's look again at those passages that we went through. And you can follow in your handout, or you can take a look at the screens, because we're going to see Jesus doing the code switching back and forth. In order to understand kingdom, we have to understand the micro and the macro. So take a look at Matthew 26, starting at verse 8. Jesus says, but the disciples were indignant when they saw this. Saw what? Saw Mary of Bethany pouring out an expensive jar of perfume over Jesus' feet and then washing his feet with her hair. The disciples were indignant when they saw this and said, "Why this waste? For this perfume might have been sold for a high price and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you bother the woman? For she has done a good deed to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you don't always have me." So what is Jesus talking about here? The first part of that is macro, right? We're worried about the poor as a group. Why wasn't this sold and given to the poor? But Jesus is saying you're always going to have the poor with you. That system out there is always going to be thus. But you're not always going to have me. And he immediately switches, he code switches back to the micro. Mother Teresa does this brilliantly. She says, it's a lot easier to send a cup of rice halfway around the world than it is just to deal with the people in your home. So much easier. Switching from macro to micro. When we think of things in the macro, we can keep them at arm's length. We can think of them theoretically, abstractly. They don't ever really touch us if we keep them out there someplace. Jesus is saying, bring it back into your heart. What happens here? The macro issues that we deal with are never an excuse to keep us from the vulnerability and the connection that micro relationships and mercies necessitate. We have to be able to move back and forth between the two. So when they present him with the macro, he immediately changes the context, brings it back to the micro. Because until we have a micro connection, until we understand mercy and compassion, we will never be able to do justice well in the macro. We won't understand the two. We will mix them up. Take a look at Matthew 22. Starting at verse 8. But the disciples, I'm one off. The whole day I've been one off. Matthew 22, verse 19. "Show me the coin used for the poll tax." This is after they asked him, should we pay taxes to the Romans? And they brought him a denarius, and he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." And then he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." He's doing the same thing here. They started with a macro question to him. It was actually a trap. Because either way Jesus answered this, if he answered it in the macro, he was cooked. Right? If he said, "No, you don't need to pay taxes. These Romans stink and we shouldn't be supporting them," well, then he's going to have the Romans down the throat. If he says, "Yes, you do need to pay taxes to them," then he's going to have the people just saying, "Well, then you don't represent us. We can't deal with you." So it was a trap, and they thought they really had him. What Jesus is saying here, though, as he switches back to the micro, he says, first of all, the anger that you have to the injustice and cruelty of the Romans is completely impotent. You have no control over this. You can rage away, but that is going to continue just as the poor continue. And the anger can be such a great excuse for not coming back to the vulnerability and the intimacy that the micro requires. And so here he is. The injustice then, the macro, is not an excuse to neglect God's mercy in the micro. Give to God the things that are God's. What does that mean? It means come back to mercy and compassion in the individual relationships. And to realize that living in the macro and the anger that can often come from the injustices of the macro is going to blind us and blunt our ability to love in the micro. We need to be able to make the code shift back and forth. Take a look at Mark 10, starting at verse 20. And he said to him, teacher, this is the young ruler who comes to Jesus and says, what can I do to inherit eternal life? And he says to him, teacher, I have kept all these things from my youth up. Because Jesus had said, well, how do you read the law? He says, I understand the law. I've kept it all from my youth up. And looking at him, Jesus felt a love for him and says, one thing you lack. Go and sell all you possess and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And then come and follow me. Now, selling everything is a micro direction. He's speaking to one specific person. That doesn't mean everybody needs to sell everything. And it doesn't mean to be taken literally either. Yes, he was rich and he had things that he was identified with that were holding him down and keeping him locked in and imprisoned. But it doesn't mean that we all need to sell everything. We can't macroize what is a micro injunction, a micro direction. And we can't literalize it either. Riches aren't evil. There's nothing wrong with riches. Lots of good can be done with riches, right? But the problem is when we identify with those riches, then everything goes down the tubes. That's what he's trying to get across. The selling everything that you have works as a metaphor to stop the attachment that you have to those things. Stop the identification that you have with those things so that everything is about that. And again, you can't have the humility and the vulnerability that a micro, intimate relationship requires. At Matthew 5, starting at verse 21, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Now, when we hear those words, they seem so innocuous, especially the way that our language has coarsened over the last few decades, right? Really? You fool, you're going to go into the fiery hell? But the idiomatic expressions and those expressions in that first century honor and shame society, if you had said you fool, if you said racha to another person, that would require them to do violence back to you. They could not retain their honor without responding in some violent way. And so what Jesus is talking about is an escalation here, right? But he's also talking micro in context. This makes no sense in the macro. Just like when he says, hey, if you just think lustful thoughts about another person and you're married, you've already committed adultery and you're guilty before the court. No, you're not. If you haven't committed murder, you're not going to be guilty before the court of murder. It doesn't make any sense in the macro. Not in our agreement and not in theirs. But in the micro, it makes all the sense in the world. With that first angry thought, you have already adulterated the relationship. And if you keep on moving down that line, you are guaranteed to move into physical violence. And then you'll be guilty before the actual court. And the same thing, if you start with that first lustful thought and you follow that stream down, it will lead you into the actual act. This is what Jesus is talking about. But it's micro. He's talking about where is your heart? You're so worried about the law. You think if just you keep the law and you don't get slammed by the law, then you're good with God? He says, I got to tell you, that doesn't cut it. You're not going to obey your way into kingdom. What is happening in your heart? If you let that escalate, you're going to be guilty before the civil court as well. But nip it in the bud. Keep your heart clean. He's trying to get the people to make that shift from macro to micro. The Pharisees had made everything macro, everything about the law. Jesus is bringing it back. And finally, at Matthew 5, starting at verse 38, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him as well. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. You know, if you follow this absolutely literally, you'd be penniless and broke and naked, and you wouldn't be able to provide for anybody, including yourself. Obviously, this is not what Jesus is talking about. You'd also be all beat up and bloody, right? This is not what Jesus is talking about here. Of course it isn't. He starts with the lex talionis, which is the law of retribution. This goes all the way back to the code of Hammurabi, right? And we think that is so harsh. That is so barbaric. You're going to eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But you think about an honor and shame society. If you knock about a person's eye, they have to. They are honor bound to do something bad to your clan, and then you are honor bound to respond to them. And you got the Hatfields and the McCoys for generations. This was actually an improvement on that. It was a more kinder, gentler way of looking at it, just to even the score. Just keep it 1-to-1, right? But actually, in historical books, there's no evidence that they actually ever did this. If you knocked out a person's eye, what they would do is put you on the stand as if you were going to be sold as a slave. There's a whole other topic we can talk about later, but we won't do that right now. And they would value you as a whole person, and they value as a one-eyed person, and the difference between the two is the fine that you needed to pay to the other person. But they wouldn't actually take your eye unless that other person demanded that it be done. They could do that if they wanted to, but wouldn't you rather have the cash? I mean, you know. And so here is Jesus. He's talking about the lex talionis here. You know, this is what's going on. In other words, perfect justice, right? It's all about perfect justice, perfect fairness, and it's all in a macro context. But then he says, don't resist an evil person. Doesn't that sound absolutely immoral? Aren't there other scriptures that tell us that we are supposed to flee from evil and resist it and do all these other things? What's going on here? He's talking about individual relationships. Don't return evil for evil, he's basically saying. In other words, don't go tit for tat. That's our little version of that. I had to go and see, where did tit for tat come from? Did you, Aaron, think about that? You know? No? Gosh, I always think, why tit for tat? What's that all about? Well, if you go back to the 15th century, a tip with a P and a tap were small hits that you would do to each other. So they don't do this hit for that hit. And then somehow that ended up tit for tat. But the one I really like is that there is an old poem from I think it's the 1400s, the 15th century. And it says, tit for tat, butter for fat. If you kill my dog, I'll kill your cat. Same sort of idea. But this is what Jesus is trying to get across. You know, he's talking about micro relationships. He's talking about, maybe we could say, microaggressions, you know. Someone insults you. Well, everything in you wants to insult them back. You know, the whole slap on the right cheek, that's a backhand slap in that culture because you did everything with the right hand. Figure it out. If you're going to slap the right cheek with the right hand, it's backhand. That's a superior to an inferior. That's a condescending, you know, kind of insult, you know, a contemptuous insult. Well, don't give that back, is what Jesus is trying to say. He's talking about personal relationships. Now, the Quakers completely missed this. Their whole pacifism is based on that you're not going to, you know, you're going to turn the other cheek. And they turned that into their macro base. And the same thing with not taking oaths. They won't take oaths because Jesus said don't take an oath. He's just trying to say, hey, let your yes be yes and your no be no. In your personal relationships, keep practicing mercy and compassion no matter what. Because then what happens? You can destroy your enemies by turning them into friends. This is where he's trying to take us. By maintaining compassion, we can overcome so much, and we don't have to descend into all of this. In macro, justice must prevail. or we lose the group. But in the micro, justice is never enough. It won't be enough. We need to give all in love and continue to practice mercy and compassion, even when it's not being practiced on us. That's what loving the enemy is all about, to love those who persecute you and despitefully use you. This is where he's going with this. It's not about fulfilling rules. It's not about following the law. You cannot obey your way into kingdom because kingdom is micro and not macro. Kingdom is love-based. The law is fear-based. It's all about reward and punishment, which is fear-based. And most importantly, nothing is learned of God in the first mile. And we didn't talk about that. But the Romans could compel anybody to carry their gear for a mile or a certain specified period along the roads. And when that period, that distance had been covered, then they could give that pack back to the Roman, or their cart back. They'd get their cart back, and then they would impress somebody else to go the next mile. Jesus says, don't just go 1 mile. Go 2 miles with them. They had to be looking like him like he grew a third head, right? Are you kidding me? Are you really? The Romans were hated. They were oppressing them. They were cruel. Go another mile with them, because nothing is learned about God and God's love in the first mile of obligation. It doesn't work that way. Everything is learned of God in the second mile, the mile that is voluntary, where we just allow ourselves to move into a fearless love, because it always comes back down to fear and love. Perfect love casts out fear. It's the only thing that can, because when we know that we've got a connection that we cannot lose, then we are free to risk what vulnerability risks. This is what it's all about. If we don't understand how mercy and justice, how micro and macro work, if we can't code switch between the two, we are always going to misunderstand Jesus' message. And we are going to remain in fear of that justice, not realizing that the good news, that love of God is always there for us in the micro, one-on-one, in mercy and compassion. Justice ensures that the group will have a physical survival, but mercy ensures that we will have a spiritual survival. How are we ever going to be convinced of this? The only way we will ever be convinced that this is true is when we experience our own love flowing out to another person in that second mile, where we volunteer it, where it is no longer an obligation, when there is nothing that we could possibly get back, we just let it flow because it's our pleasure to do so. When we experience that mercy and that compassion in ourselves, then we know that it's possible for us. As much as we may feel we don't deserve it, we know it is still possible, because now we understand that God is not a slave to God's own justice. God is not a slave to God's own rules, right? That God's love is not just in the micro. It's just perfected in mercy for us, the beloved. And that's really good news. Let's pray. Father, who you are is beyond our capacity to logically understand. It makes no sense. Help us to stop trying to make sense of it. Help us to stop trying to make sense of you. And help us just to risk what we need to risk to experience what happens in the moment when we just let ourselves be merciful, compassionate, present, vulnerable. That's what we need. We need the experience of that, because you are in every exchange of mercy and compassion. They wouldn't exist without you having existed first. Help us to let go of whatever we need to let go of, to sell whatever we need to sell, in order to have the ability to take those first steps, risky steps, towards you, towards each other. Father, all we can do is throw ourselves on your mercy and your compassion and thank you for being such a God that loves us with absolute abandon. Help us to do the same in return. And never let us forget we can only love because you loved us first. In Jesus' name. All right. Everyone stand for just a moment.